be, patient one, peeling. The girl sitting across from me was trying her damnedest to look anywhere but at my face. Her eyes darted around her meager little bedroom, desperate to find something to stare at while I examined her. The only sounds that punctured the heavy silence were the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway and the occasional mutter from the recreation room, and after a moment, she began to chew hard on the nail of her little finger. "Miss Davis," I began gently, and her blue eyes, which were much too wide and large for her slender face, flickered towards me for a moment before fixing themselves determinedly on a spot on the wall. "Whenever you feel like you're ready, I'd like you to answer my question." She took in a long breath that she quickly let out in a whisper of an exhale which rattled against her tired lungs. "Yes, Dr. Bryan," she finally replied. Her voice was monotonous and soft. "I've been eating what the nurses tell me to." I smiled, and she watched me with a guarded expression. "That's good, Christine." I paused. "Do you mind if I call you Christine?" She shrugged, and through the material of her black t-shirt, I could see the bones in her shoulders jut out as she moved. Her collarbones were like a pair of knives protruding from the base of her neck, and her limbs were as thin and delicate as a newborn fawn's. But thankfully, she was still a little more filled out than the hysterical, bleeding, emaciated Christine we had admitted into our facility 2 weeks ago, whose spine had bulged against the pale skin of her back like a row of marbles. "You look like you're progressing," I added, adjusting my glasses and jotting down a few notes. She looked gloomily down at the floor. "If by progressing you mean getting fat," she muttered, "then yes, I'm progressing." "Christine, maybe I do mind if you call me Christine," she interrupted suddenly, a sullen look crossing her features. I offered her a prim smile. "I can respect that. However, Ms. Davis, fat is not a word we use around here. You are unhealthy, and you're here to become healthy. Health isn't necessarily attached to a number. It's only dependent on your body functioning normally and your ability to accept yourself inside and out. And right now, your body is well on its way to recovery. You seem much more energetic, and Nurse Jones tells me that your last checkup showed significant improvement." She looked back up at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw her eyes well up with tears. "But what if I can't stop eating?" she whispered, blinking quickly until the tears had retreated. "What if—" She raised her hands to cover her mouth and closed her eyes tightly, taking in deep, shuddering breaths through her fingers to calm herself. "I can't think about it," she said softly, her voice muffled from behind her hands. "I know. You don't need to worry. You have all the time in the world. We don't expect you to get better overnight. We're going to work with you for as long as you need to help you develop a healthy relationship with food and exercise." She nodded a little, running her fingers through her short black hair. "But that's not actually why I'm here today. I was hoping," I continued, leaning forward a little, "that we could talk a little more about the night you came to us." Her lips thinned, and she stared down at the floor. "I don't know if I'm ready to do that. We've had several sessions about your disordered eating," I urged her gently. "It's time to talk about the elephant in the room, your self-harm." Her fingers unconsciously twitched down towards her thigh, and I watched as she pressed down on the fabric of her jeans, testing the pliancy of the skin underneath it. A faint wince crossed her features as the flesh yielded to her touch. It was behavior that was typical of an anorexic, checking for bulges and soft areas that she felt she needed to improve. "What do you want to know?" she finally asked hoarsely. "Your story," I replied simply. "The whole story that leads up to you, here, right now." She chewed on her lower lip for a moment, then nodded. "Take all the time you need," I said. There was silence for a moment, but then she took a deep breath and began to speak. "I think it all started in high school. I was one of those ugly duckle, Um, Late bloomers, sorry, she said quickly as I opened my mouth to object. I nodded, and she continued. I don't think anyone ever gave me the time of day until I turned 16. That's when my face started to clear up, and I went from a size 6 to a size 4. I'm not going to lie. When I started getting more phone calls and making more friends, I was a little depressed. I was still the same weirdo, but it felt like people were willing to look past the weirdness if I was pretty. But I let it go. It was good to have friends. Since I wanted it to stay that way, I did start to develop habits. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a disorder, but I had a pattern I would follow every week. I would only let myself eat once every 2 days. In some sick sort of way, I think that made me even more popular. That was a weird time. MySpace was still a thing. Schools were filled with those scene assholes, and it was trendy to be skinny. A couple of my girlfriends and I would go to the football bleachers every day during our lunch break and just drink water and smoke cigarettes so we wouldn't be tempted to eat. I don't know. Now that I look back on it, it was pretty messed up. People are really fucked, aren't they? Anyway, when I graduated, I lost contact with a lot of my friends in high school. Most of them went to college, but I didn't have the money, so I just got a job at a grocery store and moved into an apartment with one of my coworkers a year later. His name was Derek, and he was gorgeous, and he knew it. He had this awesome life filled with beautiful people and late nights at clubs, and I loved being a part of it. He always had this way of making us feel like this young, invincible, beautiful pair of stylish socialites, even though we were only making a couple of dollars more than minimum wage and living in a pretty shitty part of the city. We both spent a ton of money on clothes. I'm sure we almost missed rent once every other month. There were a few times where we had to turn the whole apartment upside down looking for change in all the nooks and crannies. Derek wanted to be a fashion designer, and he would gush about how he wanted me to model his stuff. Don't get me wrong, he was incredible with a sewing machine, but I don't think either of us expected anything to come of it. He was always really fickle with his hobbies. We lived together for a few years, but I eventually had to move into a dorm to start school, and he went to go live with his boyfriend. We never lost touch, but I didn't have a whole lot of time for clubbing or day drinking once I started school, so we did drift apart a little. Christine paused, looking apprehensive. Until this year, when he called me and said that he had scored an entry into a little fashion show, she continued. She shifted uncomfortably and crossed her arms, folding in on herself a little. Take your time, I repeated gently. Well, I was nervous, of course, but I said yes. Who wouldn't, you know? And when I showed up at his apartment for the fitting, he had all these beautiful clothes for me to try on. All of them fit really well, except for... She took another deep, shaky breath. These fucking pants. They were made of black leather that Derek had spent a ton of money on. The way he went on about them, they were like his magnum opus. And they were amazing. But they wouldn't quite fit over my thighs. She closed her eyes. Fuck. You should have seen his face. It wasn't like he could just let out the seams a little. He barely had enough leather to finish the pants. He was so disappointed. And he told me that he could find another girl to wear them, but I felt awful, so I told him that I would, you know. Her face paled a little. Try to lose some weight. How much did you weigh at the time? About 105. She pinched her thigh again as she spoke, a little harder this time. I pretended not to notice. That's still very underweight for your height, I said slowly. They must have been impossibly small. Everyone makes mistakes. You can't blame yourself. I know, but I did. I had a month until the show, so I found a guy at school who was selling Vivance. You know, the ADH medication. She flushed a little and gave me a wry smile. Sorry, of course you know. Indeed. I took it 2 or 3 times a week. The day I took it, I wouldn't eat. I couldn't if I tried. That was the beauty of it. The day after, I still wouldn't eat. Then I would eat 500 calories the third day and start over after that. My grades got better, I guess, and it was working. By the second week, I weighed 97 pounds, and I went to go see Derek again. She trailed off, and I could see her lips start to quiver. They still didn't fit. They would fit right up until the middle of my thigh, but then they'd stop at my hips. Derek told me it was going to be okay. He knew a girl who had the right measurements, and even though he made the pants for me, she could model them. I begged him to give me another 2 weeks and keep her as a backup in case I couldn't do it. Then I went back to school and started working out every day, along with the vivants and fasting. Lots of fasting. My thighs had to be 19 inches. My waist had to be 22 inches. My hips had to be 32 inches. 22, 32, 19. Those were my encouragement words that I chanted while I worked out. I must have looked like a maniac. But despite all that, it felt like the guys on campus started to notice me a little more. I got more phone numbers that week than I've gotten in my entire life. It hurt a lot that I had to do all of this to make them give a shit about me. But it felt so good, and I was so close to my perfect numbers. She broke off with a sob and covered her mouth. After a few moments, she straightened her shoulders and looked back up at me, her expression stiff, her eyes bright with tears. But then I passed out at the gym. My mom met me at the hospital and freaked out when she saw how skinny I was. The doctors were telling her to check me into someplace like this, but I guess I talked her out of it. Miss Davis, I interrupted softly. We're talking a lot about your eating disorder, but I don't understand where. She silenced me with a look. It was some look. Angry and scared, and a hair away from a full meltdown. I inclined my head in acceptance and let her speak. I'm getting to it, she whispered. I don't know how I convinced my mom to let me go to the show, but she agreed to it. I just had to come straight home. But the night of the show, I took my measurements and... A tear rolled down her cheek. I was 2 inches away from being perfect, and I was out of time. It was my thighs, you know. Everything else was great, I guess, but everyone has that one fucking spot. I understand. No, you don't. I weighed 88.52 pounds. Every other part of me was skin and bone, but my goddamned legs wanted to stay fat and disgusting. She was suddenly very still. I was trying not to lose it when I went downstairs to see Mom, and she was what, Ms. Davis? I urged. Her lips suddenly parted into a very broad grin, and I frowned. She was peeling potatoes, she giggled, her eyes wide. For dinner, with one of those potato peeler things. And I thought it was so fascinating how the blade just slipped under the skin and peeled it all away, like she was sculpting marble. All of the parts that she didn't need just went in the trash, where they belonged. It was the perfect contraption. You could just watch the potatoes get smaller and smaller. Tears were flowing down her cheeks freely now, but that wide, terrifying smile was still firmly affixed to her face. So, I grabbed a really sharp knife and my measuring tape before I went to my car. I think I know where this is going, I said quickly. I could feel cold sweat on the back of my neck, and my mouth was suddenly very dry. She laughed again. Yeah, I bet you do, she sighed gleefully. I picked up some bandages from the drugstore near Derek's show so nobody could see what I had done. And when I tried on the pants, they fit, and everyone in the back was just over the moon about me, even though I could barely stand up. I actually got a few cards. People wanted to hire me. Derek was so excited. He kept telling me that we were going to be the stars of the show. And we would have been, you know, she continued, her eyes widening. Everything was going so well until the model behind me slipped in something and fell, and that's when they all saw the blood. The bandages must have started leaking. The smile finally disappeared from her face, and she burst into loud, ugly, racking sobs. I felt my face grow pale. "Christine, it's going to be all right now," I begged, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She quickly swatted my hand away, and her furious, tear-stained eyes locked on mine. "Don't touch me," she screamed. "Don't you get it? It's never going to be okay. Do you know what I had to do to myself to finally be someone?" She collapsed onto the bed in a heap and sobbed wordlessly, hiding her face from me. "I know that it's worthless coming from me, but you need to know that you have value, Christine, as a person," I began, but she turned away from me. I felt my brows furrow in worry when I saw a dark stain on the crook of her knee. "I can't talk anymore," she whispered shakily. "Please go away." I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes hard before standing, then walked slowly out of the room. I put a hand out to stop an orderly from walking past me, and she frowned when she saw my face. "What is it?" she said in a low voice. "Is it Christine?" "I'm afraid it is," I sighed. "Please tell the nurses to examine her legs today. I believe she's picking at her stitches again." Ward B, Patient 2, Monsters. I waited patiently, if not a little awkwardly, as the young woman in front of me sat on her knees in front of her bed, her back to me. Her elbows were resting on the mattress, her hands were pressed together, and she looked all for the world like a little girl saying her bedtime prayers. After a moment, she dipped her head down and crossed herself, then slowly rose to her feet. As she caught my eye, her lips curved into a serene smile. "Hello, doctor," she said cheerfully, lowering herself onto the mattress and shifting into a cross-legged position. Her long hair dangled over one shoulder in a neat, sleek braid, and she had a pleasant sort of warmness to her disposition. "Is it time for our session?" I smiled back before lowering myself into a chair near her bed. Usually, once it was time for our first big meeting, my patients were a bundle of nerves. Jessica Davenport, however, seemed ready to float right off the bed. I had never seen a woman look so utterly at ease, only 2 days after being committed to our asylum. "Is it a good time?" "Now's as good a time as any, I'm sure," she replied, stretching languidly. "It isn't like I have any urgent plans." I uncapped my pen, then crossed my legs and positioned my clipboard on one knee. "I didn't know you were Christian," I admitted, watching her closely. "I didn't see you at the morning prayer group on Sunday." She shrugged, a slow, fluid motion that conveyed nothing but utter relaxation. "I'm not." I raised an eyebrow. "Then why?" "What happened to me was enough to convince me that someone out there had an eye on me," she replied smoothly. "Since I arrived here, I've made it my mission to praise every deity I can think of in thanks. It's the least I can do." "Every deity?" "Sure. God, Allah, various pagan gods and goddesses," she said, offering me a little smile. "I'd like to pray to the Hindu gods, but that may have to wait until I'm out. I'm not familiar with the mantras." "I see. We might be able to work something out," I replied slowly. "Now, this thing that happened to you, are you referring to the incident that led to your arrival here?" "Yes," she sighed, raising one hand to fiddle with her long blonde braid. "Which I suppose is what you're here to talk with me about." "If you're ready." She slowly closed her eyes and exhaled, then nodded. "Where should I start?" "Wherever you believe the beginning might be." "All right." She cleared her throat, then opened her eyes. Her gaze was a bit unsettling, filled with certainty and firm resolution. "It all started with Danny, of course." "And Danny is the man that I shot and killed?" "Yes. It wasn't always so bad, though. When we first started dating, he was the epitome of a perfect gentleman. He took me to these wonderful little restaurants, refused to let me open my own doors, and always had an arsenal of sweet words at his disposal. And he was good-looking too. I was utterly mad for him. The way he looked at me, you would have guessed I was something precious that he couldn't bear to let out of his sight. And looking back on it, I suppose that should have been my first warning. It took several months for me to realize that I was unknowingly distancing myself from my friends. I don't know how I didn't notice it before. One morning, I just woke up, and it occurred to me that I hadn't seen or talked to them in a while, even though we had always been very close. And when I mentioned to Danny that I'd like to see them again, he seemed tense. I didn't think much of it. But when I finally persuaded him to let me go to a girls' night out, he bombarded me with text messages the whole night and seemed to get more and more irritated if I didn't respond immediately. My friends were worried, but I told them that it would pass. "Jessica," I said slowly, "what you've just mentioned is a textbook case of abuse." She laughed bitterly. "I know that now," she sighed. "But I was blind to it at the time. Of course, it only got worse. It all came to a head one night when I left a glass of red wine out on the nightstand. We were teasing one another and wrestling, playfully, and I knocked it right over the football jersey he had folded over his desk chair. It was his favorite. The stain wasn't big, but there were a lot of little red drops all over it." "Was it very valuable?" "Oh, I wouldn't know," she sighed, dismissing my question with an impatient flick of her wrist. "I don't follow sports, but to Danny, it was like I had just ended his whole world. I apologized over and over, but he just got increasingly more furious until he grabbed the wine glass and threw it, as hard as he could, right past my face and against the wall. It shattered, a couple of inches to the left, and it would have hit me. But immediately after seeing the look on my face, he dissolved into the perfect picture of remorse." She rolled her eyes. "I wouldn't let him touch me, but he eventually just grabbed me and kissed me and told me how sorry he was. He was even crying." Slowly, she turned her gaze down to the floor, the first action that had even hinted at any sort of discomfort. I watched her carefully. It was when he pulled away to look at me that I realized Danny had changed. She paused, and I leaned a little closer. "I'm sorry. This is the first time I've told anyone about this." "Doctor-patient confidentiality, Jessica," I assured her. "You can tell me anything." "All right." She tensed a little in her shoulders as she spoke. It was his eyes." "His eyes?" "Yes, that they had turned yellow, like an owl or something." I tried to keep my face carefully free of any expression while she watched me, trying to gauge my reaction, and she continued once she had decided I didn't think she was acting like a raving lunatic. "I thought it was just a trick of the light or too much wine, but when we woke up the next morning, there were those evil-looking eyes staring right into my soul. The strangest part was," she added, her brows knitting together worriedly, "that other than his bright yellow fucking eyes, he didn't seem any different. It was like he hadn't changed at all. And everyone around him acted the same, as if my boyfriend wasn't starting to transform into some horrible thing. At first, it really messed around with my head. I thought I was losing my mind. So I hoped that I was just imagining it, and that it would go away soon, and I tried my best to ignore it. But it only got worse. A week later, one of my friends invited me out while Danny was at work. I had the day off, but I couldn't get a hold of him to ask for permission. And yes, doctor, I'm aware that is also an example of possessive behavior," she added, as I moved to interrupt her. I promptly shut my mouth. "Anyway, since I couldn't reach him, I just left him a voicemail and headed out, which apparently was the wrong thing to do. When I got home, he was sitting in the living room, very quiet and very still. He wouldn't answer me when I asked him what was wrong. I plugged in my phone while he was ignoring me. It died while I was out. And when I turned it on, I saw exactly 20 text messages from him and 7 voicemail messages." She paused and swallowed. I had only been out for 3 hours. He finally spoke and told me that once he got my message, he tried to reach me, and, upon failing to do so, had assumed that I was in trouble and left work early to look for me. He called all of my friends too. What followed was a very loud interrogation about my actual whereabouts and several implications that I had lied about where I was. I argued with him and told him he was being ridiculous, and he got fed up and lunged at me. "Did he hit you?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I almost wish he had sometimes. It would have made my life a lot easier." Instead, he stopped just an inch away from me and held my shoulder very, very tightly. And then he just stared at me for a few minutes. He was breathing hard. I think he was trying to calm himself down. She bit her lip. But then he opened his mouth to speak, and I could see his teeth. They were different. It was like his mouth had turned into a pit of needles. I screamed and tried to get away, and he just held me there and shouted that he wasn't hurting me, that there was nothing to be screaming about, that I was overreacting. He said that someone was going to call the police if I kept acting up, and then I'd have to explain why I was being such a crazy bitch, she added grimly. I sneaked out of the bed that night after he had passed out and slept on the couch. I couldn't stand to sleep next to him. The week after that, I had a late night at work. I was actually relieved when my boss asked me to stay for a few more hours. It meant that I wouldn't have to go home and face Danny and the way he looked. I texted him to let him know, but he never responded. When I got home, he was in our room at the desk. He didn't speak for a while, but then he told me that he had been let go. I guess they had been making cuts at his office, and when he left early to come find me, it earned him a spot on the list. It was basically his dream job, so he was understandably distraught. But then he got angry and started shouting that it was my fault for acting suspicious. He even said that I probably wasn't even at work all night. She paused for a few moments and rubbed her eyes, suddenly looking exhausted. That's when he took the gun out of his desk and held it to his head. He said that I was selfish for what I did to him, that I had ruined his life, and that I deserved to watch him die. "Wait," I said suddenly. "Are you telling me that Danny killed himself?" For a brief moment, so brief that I might have imagined it, hopelessness flickered across her face. "No," she said softly. I was begging him to put the gun down, and then he pointed it at me. He was shaking and staring at me with those horrible eyes, and he said that I deserved it more than he did. He started saying horrible things, calling me a whore, telling me how the world would be better off without me, how nobody would even miss me. We stood like that for an eternity. She licked her lips. He finally put the gun down and started to apologize, but I ran. I hid in the closet and stayed there while he walked around the house shouting for me. He was in tears. I could hear it in his voice, but I didn't care. It was in that moment that I realized he was going to kill me. With a shaky breath, she folded her arms tightly in front of her chest. After a short pause, she began to speak again in a trembling voice. It might not have been that night, or even that year, but he was going to put me in the ground. I just knew it. And then I peeked around the door of the closet, and I saw him. "What do you—" "He wasn't right," she whispered desperately, her eyes brimming with tears. His skin was too pale, his fingers were too long, and I swear I saw claws. And he was still carrying his gun. I grabbed one of his old baseball bats from behind the coats, and, well, I disarmed him. Her chest began to heave with silent sobs. And then I shot him in the chest, so he would stay down. I didn't want to shoot him, but I didn't know what he would do. And his face... She trailed off and stared down at the floor, taking in deep, gasping breaths and holding her head in her hands. I stayed silent while she struggled to compose herself. "Did you tell the police that he threatened you?" I inquired once her breathing had returned to normal. She gave me an almost pitying look through her tears and let out a breath of dry laughter. Of course I did, but there wasn't any evidence that it was self-defense. I told you, he never hit me. Not once. Other than the bruises from the bat and the bullet in his chest, there was no sign of a struggle. It wasn't like there were any witnesses, and the house was in pristine condition. The police even found an engagement ring stashed in his dresser. She grimaced. Then the prosecuting attorney brought up the weekend I had spent in suicide watch at a hospital when I was a teenager. It didn't help that when the police showed up at his house, I was inconsolable and babbling about monsters with sharp teeth and big yellow eyes. At that point, it was all over. Although, I guess it did land me in here instead of prison. Her gaze flitted past me and towards the open doorway of her bedroom, pensive and calm despite the tears trickling down her face. The people here seem nice. Well, I think that's enough for today, I said briskly, rising to my feet. I've appreciated your cooperation. I'll be back in a couple days so we can discuss your treatment. She stood, nodded her head in agreement, and extended her hand. After a brief moment of hesitation, I gripped it and gave it a quick shake. One more thing, I added, as she turned and began to rummage through her duffel bag, withdrawing a tattered paperback fantasy novel. This monster you said that you saw, is this a recurring vision for you? She straightened and gave me a terse smile. Nope, that was the first time. She raised her eyebrows. But I'll be sure to warn you if I see any more. And you mentioned, I continued, that you were praying to thank the deity that let this happen to you. To be honest, Jessica, I can't understand why. Paper rustled as she lowered herself back onto the mattress and thumbed through the pages of the book, looking for her spot. I don't think it was meant to be a punishment, she said, not looking at me. I like to think that it was a blessing. Maybe I got a chance to see the real Danny before it was too late. Or maybe I'm just being optimistic about it. Nothing wrong with that. I don't think there is either. The unstable Jessica I had gotten a glimpse of only moments ago was gone, and she looked up from her book to regard me with her level stare. Have a nice day, Doctor.